Hi, the spacecraft you just saw soaring through space is the spacecraft designed by Wormonauts. It was designed for the second edition of the NANOSTAR Challenge, a project funded by the Interreg Pseudo program through the European Regional Development Fund. Wormonauts is a student team for this project composed of 6 aeronautical engineering students from University of Beira Interior in Portugal. Diogo Abranches, who was in charge of mechanical design and structure, Victor Zambori, who was in charge of putting together the satellite in CATIA, Mariana Ribeiro, who was in charge of thermal analysis and control, Raj Ansaraj, who was in charge of IDM design as well as command and data handling, Hugo Pontes, who was in charge of ADCS and mission analysis, and Ruben Santos, who was in charge of the electrical power subsystem and communications.
This project consists in the making of the preliminary design of a complete space system for a nanosatellite that will perform an ambitious scientific mission using the tools and methodology provided by NANOSTAR. The mission has the objective to verify the survivability in space of a marine photosymbiotic species of worms, which may one day play an essential role in the creation of artificial ecosystems for deep space exploration missions. The scientific payload will monitor the metabolism of the worms and their efficiency for urea and air recycling via video observations and measurements. The subsystem needed for the achievement of the mission goals could be divided into electrical, communications, command and data handling, attitude control and determination, structural and thermal. The solution was to divide the team into several subsections in order to make a more detailed work, despite this requiring a better communication between team members. Having agreed to have a sun-synchronous orbit meant that the satellite would always have direct contact with the sun and the power produced could be well managed. Also, it would provide some heat for the worms itself. Next, a good communication subsystem was required, so that the spacecraft was capable of transmitting large quantities of data since the satellite will not have always contact with the ground stations. The payload, the worms, to be filmed and photographed, with the videos and photographs being sent to Earth, and its support system was a 3U L-shaped box which was inserted into the bottom of the satellite.
Since the lighting conditions will be created by artificial means, the only parameters that affect the mission in terms of orbit are the altitude, which affects the duration of the transmission window, and the fact that it is a sun-synchronous orbit, which means that the spacecraft will be constantly under sunlight conditions. To achieve this orbit, the following parameters were set, giving us the two required orbit characteristics mentioned above. The orbit wasn't raised any higher since in those conditions the orbit wouldn't decay in 25 years, which would go against ESA legislation. With the current parameters, according to Stella, the orbit is supposed to decay in 24.7 years.
The communication subsystem is probably the most complex of the whole satellite. It features two antennas, one for UHF and one for X-band, a UHF transceiver and an X-band transmitter. While the UHF band will be used only for ground station tracking, the X-band transmission will be data heavy, as it must transmit HD videos and photographs.
The communication subsystem deals with the data gathered by filming and photographing the worms, which is collected by a camera, which in turn sends it to the OBC for conversion, which sends it to the X-band transmitter where the data is finally sent to Earth.
To have a large enough transmission time, the orbit was set to 1,300 kilometers, which, considering the 3 ground stations on display, means 411 passage of 10 minutes on average, which using X-band data rates allow us to transmit permanently gathered data. The final link budget for the X-band transmission results in a 15 decibel signal-to-noise ratio. The components that are a part of the EPS are the solar panels that collect solar energy and the battery pack that stores the collected energy for later usage. The solar panels will collect solar energy which can either be sent to power the components directly or, if necessary, to charge the battery. The satellite will operate in a cycle as shown here, going from an idle mode, where energy is being gathered as efficiently as possible, and a transmission mode, where the solar panels may not be pointing towards the sun, and, as such, it is considered that no energy is gathered. This cycle is shown here in terms of battery balance, with a steep depression whenever there is a transmission period that runs about 5 Wh, which is quickly recharged before the next transmission, posing no threat for the mission success.
The attitude determination and control subsystem features three different components: the magnetometers, which are attitude sensors, and the magnetorquers and reaction wheels, which work together as attitude actuators. There will be two pointing modes for this subsystem: one in which the satellite points to a ground station on Earth, and another one where it points the solar panels to the sun for battery recharging. Since minimizing the power consumption was a bigger issue than minimizing the mass of the satellites, two sets of actuators are used. Magnetorquers have a much lower power consumption and are to be used only when possible, since they have some restrictions regarding the axis of the Earth's magnetic field. When that is not possible, reaction wheels will be used, consuming more power but for a shorter amount of time.
The spacecraft structure is a new design based off of a few other existing structures using IL 7075 after a thorough material study. The design structure needed to provide flexibility to the team during the design process to easily adapt to different problems that came up during the challenge. It should allow us to change the location of subsystems or perform design modifications to the subsystems without the need and the necessity to redesign the main structure. Even though the design of the deployer is not required, there are some criteria that had to be followed regarding the compatibility of the satellite with it. For example, all the parts of the satellite shall remain attached during the launch, ejection, and operation. Placement of all components was done so that the satellite center of gravity was as close as possible to its geometrical center. This was done by placing all the components in the highlighted areas. Despite our efforts, the minimum distance we could achieve was about 5 centimeters. We will use a total of 6 solar panels, 12 cells, which will begin the mission closed against the two smaller sides of the satellite, and will be deployed whenever it's safe to do so with the help of a steering mechanism locking them in the place for the rest of the mission. The total spacecraft mass is about 8.88 kilograms, with the vast majority of this value coming from the payload, hence difficulty in adjusting the center of gravity.
Normally, the thermal environment that a satellite is subjected to depends on its conditions relatively to the Sun. If sunlight is being cast upon it, the spacecraft will be hotter than usual, and in eclipse conditions, it will be colder. Despite all this, the selected orbit is sun-synchronous, which means that there won't be cold conditions. The average low Earth orbit temperature was then considered, which is of 10 Celsius degrees, or 283 Kelvin. Analyzing using ANSYS software, one can see that when facing the Sun, which will be most of the mission time, all components will be at ambient temperature of 10 degrees, while the solar panels will heat up to approximately 23 degrees. Cross-referencing these values with the operational and survival temperature limits of every component, it is possible to see that all components are within operating limits, which means that the satellite is fully operational at these thermal conditions.
The command and data handling is the brain of the satellite. It consists of the onboard computer that controls everything the spacecraft does, based on various inputs. For example, when it receives attitude data from the magnetometers and it needs correction, the onboard computer will signal the attitude actuators to change the attitude in a certain way so that the attitude is corrected. Another example is that the data gathered from the recording systems that is converted into a transmittable signal by the onboard computer which then sends that signal to the transmitter, which sends it back to Earth. It also continuously controls the payload parameters as well as the charging of the batteries through a battery regulator.
This mission is a new concept and has not been done yet, which implies some risk, mainly because some of these components have not worked together in any mission before. Since this mission does not require a propulsion module or a very high orbit, the risks associated with the mission can be categorized in 4 types. If for some reason the ground station is unreachable, the data gathered could become too much to transmit. For this reason, the team has selected several ground stations that can be accessed if one of them fails momentarily, minimizing the data cost of such incidents. Should there be a battery cell failure, the fact that our batteries is about 4 times the amount necessary, it's possible to guarantee that in the event of all the battery cells fail, the remaining ones are still capable of storing the required energy for the mission. This is a very dangerous mission when it comes to the Wormonauts, which means that damaging them is quite possible, and unfortunately, if that should happen, there is nothing that can be done and the mission is rendered unsuccessful.
The ADCS is one of the most important subsystems in this mission, since pointing is necessary to gather energy and to send data to Earth. In case of a fault with the actuators, a 4th reaction wheel was introduced, which means that the satellite would still be controllable in that scenario. It is crucial that the biological matter present in the payload never reaches Earth. To guarantee this, the spacecraft is placed in orbit low enough that it will burn on re-entry within 25 years, eliminating all biological contents.
Here, a table that summarizes the risk analysis and mitigation is displayed.
The Wormonauts satellite final design is composed by many subsystems that interact with each other in order to achieve the mission objective. However, this cannot be achieved without risks. The fact that this is a completely new design for a mission that has not been done yet carries several risks, mainly because this is a small spacecraft that cannot have many redundant systems due to the space complexity. Hopefully, these risks can be mitigated or better managed with later design stages in order to have bigger odds of mission success. It is worth noticing that the Wormonauts team had some difficulties, since the design of a new satellite is a very iterative process and requires the remake of some decisions. Another great difficulty was using the IDM software, as the team didn't feel like the workshop taught us enough to deliver a full satellite design. Despite this, the team learned a lot from this project and about the nanosatellites world, as well as new skills that are going to be important for our future.